Okay, so I'm going to have a little look at some interfacings. Sometimes it's easier with a visual than it is to actually just describe it and have a photograph. Now this is a Violin G700 woven into fusible interfacing. You can see just by looking at it that it's like a cotton fabric. It's got a warp and a weft. You can see the threads going left to right and up and down. You can also see my fingers through, so you can see it's not very thick. It's a sort of semi-translucent, I guess you'd call it. And this is a woven fusible interfacing G700, which is the equivalent of Shapeflex 101 in the USA. On the other side, that's the fusible side. It feels rough to the touch. I don't think you can see there's little tiny glue dots on there, but I can assure you they're there. And with a press, that will fuse to your fabric. Now, because it's got a warp and a weft, it does have some stretch to it if you go on the bias. Now, adding this to a cotton woven fabric, if you add it so that it's the warp and the weft are going in the same direction as the warp and the weft on the cotton fabric that you're using will still maintain some of its stretch on the bias. If you offset the warp and the weft on the interfacing with your fabric, so turn it so that it's slightly off of where it is, you reduce any stretch on the bias on your host fabric. Always worth remembering. I know a lot of people say that they feel that they have to put this onto their fabric with the fibres running in exactly the same direction. I don't. It's not economical to do that. You have an awful lot of waste if you do that. And I keep all my little sort of spare bits and then I patchwork them in, so there's no way that I could possibly make sure that the warp and the weft is always going in the direction that it is on the fabric. So that's fusible woven interfacing. Now look, this is a piece of fairly cheap, generic, non-woven fusible interfacing. Now, if I hold it to the light, you can kind of see the slight sheen on this side, and that's the glue. When we look at this side, you can see that there's no warp and weft threads as such. It's almost like a mat of fibres. It's almost like it's felted fibres. And the easiest way to tell the difference, I'm not sure if this is going to work with these two smallish bits that I've got hold of, but if I make a small cut in the side of that one, and make a small cut in the side of that one, this is the cotton woven. Now I'm just going to rip it. Now you can see there, it rips in a straight line right the way across the warp threads. And you can see there's tiny little, let me just see if I can put a piece of something darker I can put behind that. So you can see, there you go. And now you can see the threads from the weaving. And if I do the same with, this is the non-woven, I'm just going to tear it. You get fibres rather than threads. It doesn't tear in a straight line, as you can see. It will tear sort of randomly, although most of them don't tear easily across them. They do have a sort of fibres are one way, so they will tear, but they don't tear easily in one direction. They tear more easily in one direction than the other, should I say. But you get fibres rather than threads. So that's the easiest way to figure out if you've got woven or non-woven interfacings. Like a lot of people, you buy interfacings from eBay or wherever, and they sit in the cupboard for goodness knows how long, and you don't know what you've got. You forget the number, you forget where it came from, and you've just got these bits of interfacing. So that's the easiest way to figure out if you've got woven or non-woven interfacing. So those are the two basic woven or non-woven. Let's move on to foam. Now, I haven't got a sample of all of the foams to show you. This is Styleville. This is the Violin foam that we can buy in the UK. It's very similar to Violin Soft and Stable or Bosal. It's a little thicker and sturdier, I feel, than the Pelon Flex foam. It has a sort of a it's a nylon fabric on either side, which holds the which is sandwiched the foam between. It's a high density foam. It's about 5mm thick. If you squeeze it, it immediately bounces back to shape. If you scrunch it, it immediately bounces back to shape. This is non-fusible, although you can buy a fusible version. I'm always a little bit dubious about fusible foam because it does tend to wrinkle, so buyer beware. But this is the foam that we use within bag making. Now, I've talked a little bit in my document about headliner or scrim foam, and this is a piece of headliner scrim foam. Now, if I hold it up, you can see the difference in thickness. Again, this has got a sort of a nylon mesh on one side and then almost like a felted side. Now this is, if this is 5mm, you can see that is probably less than half the width. It's about 2mm thick, which is enough if you're making a makeup pouch or something very small. But this doesn't stand up as well as this does, as the Styleville. And it doesn't last as well. Styleville will still be nice and stiff and give you the support that you need in your bag 2 years down the line. This doesn't really. It's okay to use, and a lot of people still like to use it. And I will admit that I use it for small things, makeup pouches and stuff like that. But for a big bag, this doesn't have the stability or the structure that Styleville has, and you can see the difference. Huge difference. Now, if you are planning on buying headliner or scrim foam, as it's sometimes called, there are different sorts of headliner and scrim foam. Always look for the stuff that has this sort of felted one side and nylon on the other. This is a cheaper, well, it wasn't actually cheaper, it was about the same price. It's about the same thickness, perhaps a little bit thinner. It has a thin nylon mesh on one side, but it just has the bare foam on the other side, and it's absolutely gutless. It's much more gutless than this one. It's not worth having. It really isn't. I have used it because it was sent to me in error, and when I complained, they said you can keep it. And because I've got 10 meters of the stuff, I thought, right, well, I will have to use it. And I doubled it up because that's the only way I could use it. But even then, it still doesn't have the structure that you get from foam that's actually designed for the purpose. So those are foams. It's all, I do believe that there are some things that you can buy cheaper and you can substitute for other things. But I do believe that foam is not one of them. It's worth spending the money on proper foam stabiliser for your bags. Now, if you're not a fan of foam, or you think that sewing with this is going to be too tough because this gets quite thick, if you've got 2 layers of this plus your exterior fabric and you're stitching across it, you've got sort of 12mm or so to get underneath your presser foot. Not every machine will manage that. Although it does compress, so it's not quite as bad as it sounds. Then Fusible Fleece is the way forwards. Now here we have a small sample of Fusible Fleece. This is a low loft fleece, so it's approximately 2mm thick, and you can see, if I dismantle this a little bit, you can see that it's sort of a polyester, a meshed polyester on what looks like a non-woven interfacing background. So I believe that this is, if you try and tear it, it's quite strong. You get lots of fibres from the polyester, but you also get fibres. Let's find my grey bit again so you can see. Fibres from the wadding bit, but this front piece is I believe is a non-woven interfacing, and if I pull it off, quite a lightweight non-woven interfacing. That's what's got the glue on, and you can see if I move the wadding, never dismantled this stuff before, how fabulous. You can see the glue dots on there when you put it against the grey background. So this is your Fusible Fleece, so it's effectively fleece, polyester wadding, polyester fleece which has just lots of fibres. And that is actually attached to a non-woven interfacing. So what you end up with is something that's that sort of thickness. Now it fuses well, however, in some circumstances I've found if you cut your fabric first and then fuse your interfacing, the fabric shrinks. Also, a lot of people have issue with wrinkles. It does cause wrinkling, and I believe that's because this is a non-woven interfacing on the back here. The bit that actually adheres to your fabric is non-woven. So I generally, if I'm going to use fusible fleece, will put a layer of woven fusible interfacing and then put my fusible fleece across the top of that, or across the back of it, should I say. So that gives you some structure. It's soft and it does have some sort of bounceability. It does bounce back, but it gives you a little bit of structure. It's nice for things like hobo bags or small makeup bags, or things that you want to be slouchy, so not to have a proper stand-up structure to them. It's also quite nice if you're quilting. If you're quilting on a bag or on a pouch, it's quite posh, quite nice. Comes in low loft and high loft. The high loft is about 3.5 millimeters high density, and this is the low loft, which is about 1.5 to 2 millimeters. And this is the Violin product. I've also got Thermolam, which is very similar, which is I think it's a Pelon product. So there you go, that's fusible fleece. Moving swiftly on to this, which is Decaville. Now this is I'm just gonna pull that little bit off. Now I think you can probably see there's a shiny side, and this is the side that has glue on it, and it's matte glue. It's not little dots. It's a flat surface. It's nice and shiny and smooth. It feels like card, but it's very, very thick and very, very strong. If I pull it, it's really, really strong. When it's fused to fabric, it gives almost a feel of leather. Now it's not very thick, as you can see. It doesn't have a great deal of thickness to it. So it's great for adding strength, but without the bulk. So often used in purses and wallets, because you don't want lots of thickness in purses and wallets because you've got lots of layers. I like to use small strips of it at the top of my card slots when I'm making purses and wallets, just to reinforce the top of the card slots. It's got lots of uses. It's not as cheap as some of the other interfacings, so we tend to not use vast quantities of it in bag making, certainly not in the UK. I think all interfacings are cheaper in America than they are here, but this is Decaville. It comes in Decaville Heavy and Decaville Light. This is actually the lighter version. The Decaville Heavy is fractionally thicker and just fractionally stiffer. So it gives a leather feel to your fabric. You don't need to add woven interfacing as well. You can just apply this directly to the wrong side of your fabric. You can actually make whole bags using this as the stabilizer. However, it is quite stiff once it's fused. So turn it up. I'm not sure what that noise is in the other room. So turning your bag can be quite troublesome if you use this for the entire bag. So you'd often have to use a drop-in lining, and I'm not going to go into what a drop-in lining is, but it means you don't have to turn your bag. And we usually turn our bag either through a pocket, interior pocket, exterior pocket, or through a hole in the lining. So you're sort of scrunching your bag up, pushing it through a hole, and then pulling it out again. So using something like this, which when it's fused is quite stiff, can be quite difficult if you're birthing a bag that way. Then we have Peltex. Now this is, I've only got a couple of small pieces of Peltex. This is another stiff interface. You can see it's a bit thicker. It's about 1 millimeter in thickness. It's rough to the touch. If I run my nail across it, hopefully you can hear that that's catching. It's really quite rough. It's like sandpaper, in fact. If I rub myself, I'm actually sort of scratching. It hurts. This is, I believe, double-sided fusible. I have got some single-sided somewhere, but I couldn't find it. It's stiff. It's like card. When it's fused, it's really, really stiff. It makes great bag bases. I like it for flaps on purses because it's thick enough to give enough substance, but it's not too thick that it bulks things out. A lot of people use it for bag bases. That's not something that I generally use as a bag base because I think it's quite expensive for that. So yeah, that's Peltex. And while I've got you here, I've got a couple of other little bits that I just wanted to show you. So we talked about, I talked about bag bases, and this is the plastic mesh that is often used for bag bases. I very rarely use it for bag bases, it has to be said, because I just think it's too expensive. When I was when my kids were at school, they used to use it for doing practice cross stitch and stitching and stuff like that. So it's often used for other things as well. It's stiff, works really well as a bag base, and because you've got the holes in it, you can push the prongs of your bag feet through. However, I'm quite happy to use this, which is this is a flexible chopping mat. This is an opaque one, but I've got them in colours as well. I think this one came from eBay, but I have had them from IKEA and from the pound shop. I know you can buy them at the dollar store in the US. Flexible chopping mat, I use it for all sorts of different things. This one is actually I've used for a template for cutting card slots in something, I think, hence the 3 inches written on it. Often they're shiny ones, so I'd usually have a rounded edge. They're quite thin, flexible chopping mats. You need an old pair of scissors to cut them. Don't use your best scissors, but they work really well for bases for bags. You can punch a hole in to put your feet through. They also work really well to act as a template if you want to use them for templates for things. So cut around your pattern pieces and make plastic templates of your pattern pieces for bags that you use a lot. Works out a lot cheaper than keep printing paper patterns. And if you're not rich enough to be able to afford acrylic templates, then this is the way forwards. Definitely, it helps you to keep your patterns nice and fresh, and you can write on them. So if you have any notes that you want to write, you know, added an inch to the whatever the name of the pattern is. We did a meagre at 90%, and you can write that on there. I often write how many hours it takes me to make one if I've done a bag, something if I'm doing a bag. So I'll write, you know, Zeta 3 hours, something like that, whatever it takes me to, however long it takes me to make one. But plastic cutting mat has lots and lots of uses, and bag bases is just one of them. However, this is what often is called for in patterns. So this is the plastic mesh bag base, and I think that's probably about it. There are lots and lots and lots of different interfacings, and I generally use very few of them. I tend to use my foam, I tend to use the woven interfacing. I will occasionally use a little bit of Peltex, occasionally a little bit of Decaville, and generally the cutting mat, sometimes a little bit of headliner. But oftentimes you don't need all of the interfacings. You don't need to have a bolt of every single interfacing. It's cheaper to buy by the bolt than it is to buy by the meter. If you're a new bag maker, don't go and buy yourself a bolt or something. Buy yourself a meter and see how you go. If you need something thicker than a woven interfacing, then you can always use 2 layers. You know, pop 1 layer on, fuse it to your fabric, and pop a 2nd layer across the top. And you go from having a medium weight to having a medium to heavy weight. And you can continue to add layers if that's what you've got. Don't go and buy something else specifically. Just add to what you've got. Add to what use what you have. Unless you think you're going to use something else a lot, I wouldn't bother. If I'm asked for super stiff interfacing and I don't have any, what I'll use is a layer of woven, then a layer of non-woven, and this doesn't crease. If you put the non-woven in between the woven, it doesn't crease. A layer of non-woven and then a layer of woven across the top. So basically I'm making a triple sandwich on the back of my fabric. I've got this non-woven in light, medium and heavy. this is just a cheap generic one. It's not a decent one. Violin, I think it's F220 is the non-woven one that a lot of bag makers use in place of a woven interfacing. I think it's a light to medium weight, but this is a lightweight, class as a lightweight non-woven interfacing, and I would put that between 2 layers of medium woven to create a much heavier, stiffer interfacing. It's about experimenting, and it's well worth cutting little squares of fabric and ironing and pressing the interfacings to them and just writing on the back what each one is, and then pressing sort of combinations, so perhaps 2 layers of this, or a layer of this and a layer of this and a layer of this, and you know, combinations thereof, and keeping them in your sewing room, in a box or in a bag somewhere, so that you can get them out and feel what each different interfacing feels like. So when you're making a bag and you're perhaps asked for something you don't have, you can come up with a suitable substitute based on what you do have in stock, because most bag makers will have woven interfacing and some kind of foam stabiliser, and nearly everybody that sews will have invested at least a couple of pounds in some of this stuff. I don't know how many pounds I've spent on it over the years. It's rubbish, but it has a place. You need to be very careful because generic non-woven is, well, if you pay £1, you get a pound's worth of quality. It says it all, really, doesn't it? So there you go, ladies. That's it's a quick talk about interfacing, because I don't use hundreds of different sorts of interfacings. I don't have samples of the things that you have in America anymore. I've got rid of all of that because I don't need it. I just have what I use here. So hopefully that will help.